Hey, welcome to Christians in a Cancel Culture, a podcast where we talk about how to talk about what we're not supposed to talk about, and how to do it graciously, intelligently, biblically. We're glad you're here. Hey, how you doing? I'm Joe Dallas. Thank you for joining me. We want to talk about what I call abortion fatigue. That's actually a phrase I'm borrowing from my friend Hank Hinnegraaff of the Christian Research Institute. A couple of months ago, I was discussing abortion with Hank, and he made a comment that has really stuck in my craw. He said, I think American Christians are suffering from abortion fatigue. And that got me thinking about how easy it is for something to lose its shock value. Just keep talking about it, just be exposed to it. And perhaps most of all, just feel as though you are on such an uphill battle when you're trying to oppose that particular thing. And it's very easy to just accept it as business as usual. Have we reached that point on the life and death issue of abortion? Maybe so. If we have, what can we do about it? Well, our guest today is going to help answer that. And boy, the man is qualified to do just that. John Lomperis. He's the United Methodist director at the Institute of Religion and Democracy. He earned his bachelor's degree in religious studies from the University of Chicago. He's got his MDiv from Harvard University, no less. He's also served as the United Methodist elected General Conference delegate. John is a prolific writer, and I can testify to that. I've read many of his articles, and they are excellent. He's written on issues related to the church, different social issues, and many of his posts have also appeared in the Juicy Ecumenism blog site. Now, this is someone who has been in the trenches. John has been stalwart in being a voice for biblical truth on issues of human sexuality and on abortion and on progressive Christianity. And yet he made a comment I especially wanted to pass on to you here, because on the one hand, it is so critical that we be clear in our positions as Christians. And yet it's so easy to do that with the wrong attitude and ultimately perhaps do more damage than good. Along those lines, let me quote John. One of the most recurring themes of fallen human history is how righteous outrage and the desire to do something so often results in people making situations worse. Yeah, that's something I say frequently on this show. It's not just where you stand, it's also how you stand. So, John, I want to welcome you and I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Joe. Pleasure to be on here.
Absolute pleasure getting to meet you and getting to have a little time to converse with you. One thing I appreciate that I also want to make sure our viewers understand, you have been very involved in discussions within your denomination, the United Methodist Church. On this podcast, we talk about key social issues that too often Christians are either compromising on or overreacting to. And I think you've pretty well modeled how to take a clear position without allowing the rhetoric to get amped up to the point where you're alienating people. And I think your writing testifies to that. On this issue of abortion, I wonder if Hank Hinnegraaff was right. He pointed out that we might be experiencing abortion fatigue, that is sort of a weariness on the topic, and especially the feeling like, oh, this is such an uphill battle. I mean, in so many ways, the tragedy of innocent lives being taken, it is continuing on a daily basis. It continues as we speak. Do you agree? Do you feel that that kind of a fatigue is settling in? And if so, have you got any ideas of what we can do about it?
I'm not sure if I've seen that settling in across the board. I mean, I can say on the political front, which of course is not the only front that matters, although it does
Mm-hmm.
matter for with regard to matters of abortion. I know I've lived my entire adult life in very blue state kind of areas where um, the unpopularity of pro-life sentiment and the difficulty in getting any kind of headway can be discouraging and cause weariness. At the same time, we have, some clear biblical principles like the fact that Galatians chapter 6 verse 9, and let us not grow weary while doing good, for in
Good.
due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. I think sometimes it's natural human nature to be impatient with things, but I think that the reality is we live in a fallen world. It's going to be a fallen world until Christ returns. There's going to be issues that we're going to continue to have, and we yeah, but the reality is I don't think anybody would say that if a church's efforts somehow resulted in there was a burning building and then three families their lives were saved from the burning building because of the family's efforts. uh I don't think anybody would say, well, there's lots of fires and arsons around the world, and okay, they save those families, but I don't think anybody should ever try to save any other family from any fire ever again. I don't know anybody on any side of any issue who would say that. And by that same logic, if a church's pro-life efforts are directly responsible for somehow saving the lives of a dozen babies from abortion one year, they should keep doing it, because that's a categorically good thing. I think that sometimes we can get impatient and think of it with the mindset of, like, well, we ended slavery in 1865 and that was a once and for all ending. uh Again, I think that's with abortion, that's kind of a bit of a wrong way to look at it. Yes, there's the legal front of Roe v. Wade and whatnot, but the temptation to abortion, the need to redirect women towards alternatives, is, I expect, to always be with us until Christ returns.
Yeah, I would strongly agree. I mean, to the families who were saved from those burning buildings, I would say it makes a heck of a difference. It may
Absolutely.
well be that there are hundreds of other buildings that are being burned down, but for those who were saved, for heaven's sake, that's life. That's life.
Absolutely.
You know, um, I hate to admit this, but I did not realize this was a life and death issue, even as a Christian, for a number of years. And oddly enough, after I had been a Christian for about 6 years and then backslid very significantly and actually became a gay activist, it
Mhm.
was in those years of me promoting the idea that homosexuality and Christianity were compatible that I actually became aware more of what abortion was. And that was because I had a lesbian friend, also an activist. So here I was, openly gay man, openly lesbian friend, but she was a nurse. Now we were both as blue state could get at that time. And yet she said to me, I will never again scrub for an abortion because, to put it crudely, what I saw was a trash can full of dead babies. And if that
Mhm.
isn't murder, there's no such thing as murder. And that was the first time I started thinking of abortion as something other than a rather inconvenient form of birth control. And ever since then, it has seemed to me that, my gosh, this as an issue, this is life and death, and this has a lot to do with our approach to the value of human life. That's what got me more willing, especially after I had repented of the sexual sin in my own life and started getting myself back on a more biblical course. I've been much more outspoken about the issue. How did you come to involve yourself in addressing this?
Well, I also kind of grew up thinking of abortion as just maybe a particularly inconvenient form of birth control. I didn't really
Hmm.
see it as life or death. I grew up in a church going family, but not really evangelical, was more mainline. So my parents weren't, NARAL activists or anything. I just grew up kind of thinking of being anti abortion as one of those peculiarly Roman Catholic things like praying to Mary. And
Yeah.
I knew I wasn't Catholic, so I didn't think it really applied to me. But then I became a born again evangelical in college, at a very secular college, but was discipled by InterVarsity Christian Fellowship to really
Oh,
understand the key importance of the existence of absolute truth and the reality of God given morality is something that comes from God rather than something that we invent for ourselves. And then I went with a friend on what was supposed to be a fun weekend evening to see the movie. I don't know if you know I recall the movie with Michael Caine and Tobey Maguire, The Cider House Rules.
oh, sure. Yep.
Yeah, that was a friend of mine described it as like a 2 hour commercial for abortion.
Right.
That it very explicitly and in a very on the nose way frames promotes an pro abortion rights perspective, but very directly frames it as in terms of being based on rejecting absolute truth and rejecting God given morality. So then I'm like, whoa, so in order to have a pro choice position, I would need to have a firm pro choice. I would need to reject the bases of my faith, really. And it got me that really sparked a lot of thinking in me. And oddly, also that movie seemed to, at one point, even defend abortion as a way to cover up for sexual predators, which is odd that they included that in there. But it also
Wow.
got me thinking of a family member of mine who's, my cousin I see is every bit as much as any of my other cousins, but she's adopted from India. And when I see people saying that on the left that, well, we need to have what we have problems, there's not enough abortion access. We need more abortion access in low income communities in different parts around the world. When I hear people say we need widespread abortion access, I hear them saying there's people that I love who should have been killed. And so I helped some friends in college start a pro-life club at the University of Chicago. And then I found out about my own denominations, looked for what my own denomination, United Methodist Church, had said or involved in the issue. And I was horrified to find out that my denomination was on the record as officially supporting this really extreme group called the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, that
Right.
RCRC, that it actually is, RCRC is the acronym, Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And they take the extreme position of, politically lobbying against any even mild restriction or regulation of abortion and even late-term abortions, and stridently denouncing even any moral disapproval of abortion, and even having, promoting these like publicity stunt services where you have people dressed in clerical collars and pronounce blessing upon abortion clinics and claim that the work that they do is holy work.
I've seen the photos. Chilling.
Yeah, I got increasingly involved, and finally at the 2016 General Conference, which is the highest governing body of the United Methodist Church, we voted by about a 60-40 margin to essentially divorce our denomination once and for all from RCRC. And in that same time, I was involved in another effort that got less attention, but was just as important, was to repeal an official resolution that was a position statement of the denomination endorsing Roe v. Wade. And we voted by a similar margin to repeal that. So that's no longer an official position of my denomination.
Excellent. Excellent. I find it ironic. On the one hand, there are religious groups that are, as you say, promoting and even blessing the idea of abortion. And it is generally those same groups who will say that it is life-threatening to offer biblically based counsel to people who want to walk away from homosexuality or transgenderism, because they say that devalues human life. And then the same people will turn around and say, but the human life within the womb, of course, that should be destroyed. In fact, my first conversation on this, where I really did take a pro-life position, was one I had with a school teacher who was telling me, well, Joe, abortion is necessary because I see these kids every day who were raised in unhappy homes. They were raised with parents who didn't want them. They were raised in poverty. And it really was unfair that their parents had to carry them. And I said, wait a minute, my gosh, you teach these kids every day. Are you honestly saying you would prefer that they had never lived? And somehow this is something that gets past a lot of people is, wait a minute, what are you saying, that anytime a child was accidental, unwanted, or inconvenient, it shouldn't have been born? You've just eliminated quite a bit of the human population.
I have 3 kids who I love to death, and I can tell you there's no such thing as a convenient child.
There are resounding amens going around on computers around the country right now. No, of course not. I would fully agree, but my gosh, again, it really was one of the cleverest things I think ever done in the pro-choice movement, to divert attention away from whether or not this is a life and onto the convenience factor. Because then, of course, you're really not talking about the thing at all. When you talk about convenience, when you talk about the right to choose and so forth, you're not even talking about abortion. Thereby, you've completely diverted away from the question of whether or not this is a human life. You've been a part then of what we could generally call the pro-life community. And I know that's a very loose term, but you have been one of the voices taking a pro-life position for some time. Over the last couple of decades, have you seen any particular changes in our community, the community of those of us who take this position?
Well, of course, I've not been involved as long as some others, but I observed maybe a few changes, just in my observation and sense from involvement. When I went in 2003, very shortly after I really started getting involved in this issue, I went to the annual National Right to Life convention that the National Right to Life Committee has, and they had it in St. Louis this year, and then that year, and they had it met over a weekend. So on a Sunday morning, they had a separate Catholic service and a Protestant, all Protestants together in one room, and it was, it was really kind of pathetic. We could have, fit Protestants into this. All the Protestants could have probably fit into the small office I'm sitting in right now, and with some room to spare. And then the Catholics, they needed for their mass, they needed this huge ballroom. But I have sensed that there hasn't been less Catholic involvement, but there has been it has been less heavily dominated by Roman Catholics, as others, particularly more evangelicals, have gotten to be more actively involved, which is a positive thing. I think another change is I sense that in earlier years there was, don't get me wrong, I am a conservative, theologically orthodox, Bible believing Christian who's pretty politically conservative, but I also see that sometimes, it's valuable in having, if somebody can at least agree with you on abortion, if they don't agree with you on everything else, it's, hey, if at least they agree with you on being pro-life, that's a good thing. And something we want to encourage. But in earlier years, I really sensed there was a bit more of a lot of prominent pro-life leaders framing the cause as a package deal with all kinds of other conservative and Christian matters of worldview, and also sometimes using some strident rhetoric, which, as you say, alienates some people. Like
Right.
at the March for Life, there was this phrase that I kept wincing every time it was used, but it was used every year. The phrase, the feminist abortionists and their evil agenda, and
Great.
that kind of rhetoric
Great.
fire up the base and make
How
us
to
feel
win friends and influence people.
yeah, somebody who's on the fence, not sure to believe. I'm not sure that's very persuasive.
Yeah.
But so there seems to have been more recognition of the need to not alienate people, to reach out to people who might not be politically conservative across the board, that might not be a Bible believing Christian theologically across the board. I love it when people agree with me on everything, but if people can agree with me on at least one thing, especially something this important, that's also great. I think that there's also kind of it's important to understand the pro-life movement as kind of a twofold front, of both winning the culture and winning hearts and minds, so that when people are actually faced with crisis pregnancies or whatnot, that they make life-affirming decisions, and that others support women in those situations in practical ways. And then also the level of political policy. And I think particularly as somebody who's lived in more blue state, urban, educated areas, I think a lot of my friends have not always seen, who are Christians in these more liberal environments, even if they have pro-life values at their core, people don't always understand the importance that actually policy really makes a difference. Like the Hyde Amendment alone, that one policy of limiting federal funding for abortion has been credited with saving so many lives. And I avoid making political endorsements in my ministry, but I think we can say objectively on matters of policy directly related to abortion, there was no contest between President Trump and his opponents. There was just very stark contrasts. But I think
nobody could challenge you on that one.
Yes, but I think there can be an opposite error of what I was describing before, of not paying attention enough to the cultural front of winning hearts and minds. And I might get myself into some trouble here, but I think that apart from anything else, and apart from even how we voted, now that all that's over, some of Donald Trump's degrading and frankly sexually immoral treatment of women and approaches to refugees, I personally don't see as very consistent with a strong principled commitment to human dignity. And I also see a very practical and, in some ways, you could say strategic element, that it can be when people see, they go to a pro-life rally and say, oh, it's just to support abortion, and then they see a bunch of red MAGA hats, then that can be very alienating if they don't want to sign on for other things related to the person of Donald Trump. And so, but there can be, in some parts of the pro-life movement, I feel in the last 4 years, there's maybe not been enough attention to some of those concerns about hearts and minds.
No, I would not only agree with you on that, but I would also point out that if we are monolithic in our approach to anything, I don't see how we can have credibility. If somebody is blindly expressing allegiance to any political leader and unwilling to criticize any political leader or blindly allegiant to any particular party, then they almost sound cultish, like somebody who's part of a
Mhm.
group where the leader can do no wrong and we have our prescripted things that we say and so forth. I actually find it more powerful, more influential when we are not only willing to criticize our own leadership, our own affiliation, even our own denomination when it's wrong. I
Mhm.
also find it more influential to quote people and draw on the influence of people who may not be aligned with me as a Christian. Now, just for example, John, the person I quote the most often when I'm arguing a pro-life position is Jack Nicholson.
Mm.
Now, to my knowledge, Mr. Nicholson has not been born again. I would certainly see no, I very respectfully would say I see no evidence of that. And yet he has very openly said, I don't go along with my uh, particular constituency on this issue. He said, I'm
Mhm.
glad my mother was pro-life. You know, that's a very
Mm.
powerful statement coming from someone who's coming from a particularly secular position. The same is true of
Yeah.
someone who is, if they're a humanist or if they're a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or an atheist or whatever. I mean, I think when we are evangelizing, we need to be very clear in our gospel position. When we're speaking to an issue, that's another matter. And I would
Mhm.
rather speak as a coalition of voices. And I think we have much more, just as you were saying, much more influence and much more credibility when we do. I also think that science seems to be backing us up more than ever on this one. I mean,
Absolutely.
honestly, John, when I first believed that abortion, I mean, I'm saying this as a Christian, when I was a young Christian, I thought, oh, abortion is birth control, big deal. Um, that was back in 1971. Now,
Mhm.
you couldn't really see a baby within the womb the way you can now. There was not the evidence that,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, look at that. How do you call that tissue, for heaven's sake?
Mhm.
It does seem that science is coming down more and more on our side. That said, Roe v. Wade is, of course, the issue that people so often get back to. Do you think there is, given the current political climate, the current social climate, any chance in the foreseeable future of seeing Roe v. Wade overturned? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think absolutely. I think
Really?
it's. I think. I think there's a lot of times so many on the left. They talk about pledging loyalty to Roe v. Wade when how many of those people, especially politicians, that say Roe v. Wade is this some sacred gospel that not one letter can be changed, it needs to be defended absolutely. How many of
Hmm.
them have actually read the case or its important companion case that was decided at the same time? Doe v. Bolton. I read both of those cases for a constitutional law class I took some years ago, and it's really not good argument, not on a solid foundation. Even some scholars who, in their personal view, in terms of what they prefer, would consider themselves pro-choice. Some have admitted that, well, it's really not good law, this case, and it probably could have been overturned long ago if it hadn't been really artificially propped up by all the millions and millions of dollars that Planned Parenthood and its allies have spent to essentially buy politicians in ways that have really poisoned the workings of the Supreme Court.
Hmm. We're looking at this just as you said earlier, as a multi-pronged approach, and I think that's the best one
Mhm.
to take. There are the legal issues.
Mhm.
I don't know any believers who are not praying that Roe v. Wade be overturned, and yet. You're right. The power to influence is still there, regardless of who is in the White House, what the Supreme Court makeup looks like, and
Mhm.
whether or not Roe v. Wade ever is overturned. God grant that it be so. But there are also the conversations we're having at the grassroots level. Now, this podcast in particular is about those conversations. That's why we call it Christians in a Cancel Culture. We are Christians in a culture increasingly hostile to many of our key positions on social issues, this, of course, being one of them. So, along that line, somebody says, hey, you guys, first of all, look at you. You're a couple of men. What right do you bozos as men have talking about abortion? The thing I often hear is no uterus, no opinion. How do you respond?
Well, I mean, I think that obviously that's a standard that only gets applied one way. I don't hear anybody saying that President Biden or Senator Chuck Schumer shouldn't advocate for abortion because they're
Boom.
male.
Boom.
And I also, I mean, you can, obviously there's problems with this analogy, but you can say that, well, in the debate we had over slavery 150 years ago, generally people in the North that were abolitionists they didn't on their own have to figure out how to manage plantations with or without slaves. And
Correct.
it's essentially the logical fallacy of ad hominem, where you don't have an argument against the actual argument. You don't have a counter argument. So you just try to attack the person and say it's invalid. I'm a father of 3 kids. I looked at, the ultrasound of all 3 of my kids. That was very precious life. I valued my children from the moment they were conceived. I didn't start loving them the moment they took their first breath or sometime, after I cut their umbilical cords.
Uh-huh.
And, there's plenty of men who, I don't have this testimony personally, but, to refer to my earlier point, that they were adopted and they have a very personal stake, and also being able to say that, hey, if you folks had your argument about abortion being more widespread, I might have been killed. And and most people it's clear to see how they have a direct stake in wanting to argue that they should not have been killed.
And in fact, plenty of women could say the same, couldn't they?
Absolutely.
I mean, there are plenty of women who are alive and thriving because their parents chose life.
Yes. And also there's been, the Wanda Franz, former head of National Right to Life Committee, Beth Ann Cook, a good friend of mine, a pastor who led the fight at General Conference of the United Methodist Church against the Religious Coalition on Reproductive Choice. So many of the most strongest and wonderful voices and leaders in the pro-life movement have also been women. It is not just a matter of old white guys.
Yeah, John, I've noticed that actually I find more open vocal support coming from the female population for the pro-life movement and the pro-life position, even than from the male. I like to point out, too, good heavens, this is a human issue.
Absolutely.
This is not a male issue. This is not a female issue. This is a human issue. Another very common argument, and one that I do think we need to respond to reasonably. You look at the woman in crisis pregnancy. She's in a terrible position in many cases. One fear that is brought up, and I can see why people would be concerned about it, although I've got my own opinion strongly, is the specter of back alley abortions.
Mm-hmm.
If Roe v. Wade is overturned, if you guys have your way, women will be reduced to having to go into these horrible, unsanitary conditions and take their lives into their own hands, getting what are referred to as back alley abortions. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think I would first of all want to, there's a couple myths that work here. First of all, I'd want to respond. I think a lot of people in the popular consciousness, they think overturning Roe v. Wade is one and the same as outlawing abortion throughout America,
right,
in all 50 states. And so that is why I think you see, how do you feel about abortion, and more of an even divide, but, very stronger majorities favor keeping Roe v. Wade, because they think that's what it means. And what it would actually do is it would if you overturned Roe v. Wade, each state would set its own policies. There's right now several states, Mississippi and Missouri are 2, I think, that are already down to having 1 abortion clinic. So you go down from having 1 to having another. That's not as huge a change as people think. There's probably states like New York and California that are going to keep abortion with very permissive policies for probably a while, unfortunately.
I can't imagine anything changing here in California, John. Roe v. Wade or no Roe v. Wade.
Or Oregon, for that matter.
Yeah.
Sadly. But then another myth is this idea that I think it was Bernard Nathanson, who is the former head of NARAL, the pro-abortion activist group, has later admitted that they flat out lied in saying that 5,000 to 10,000 women were dying every year in dangerous back alley abortion. He's flat out admitted that was just a straight up lie, that the true numbers were like, we're not talking the thousands or even the hundreds, but more like in the dozens. And these were not actually literally taking place in dirty back alleys with trash cans and some shady drug dealer type with a coat hanger, that these were generally being done by physicians who were trained physicians and who kept doing abortions when they were legal. And, you can't, it's just illogical if you actually stop and take that apart, to think that somebody cannot be, if I was an abortionist in 1972 and kept doing an abortion in 1974, it's not that I was a dangerous back alley butcher and then I'm a wonderful public servant helping serve women. It's an illogical argument. I mean, obviously, we want health and safety, and for all people, we don't want any death is a tragedy. But I think there is a huge exaggeration of that. And if there's any other situation where there's the risk of another person, somebody being killed, if there's, the way you handle it is you try to find a solution that has nobody being killed rather than just having a few less people being killed.
Yeah, exactly. In my book, Christians and a Cancel Culture, which this podcast is based on, I have a chapter on abortion in which I do have some documentation from pro choice leaders admitting, just as you said very freely, that the figures were wildly inflated when they made and continue to make arguments that the back alley abortion specter is an inevitability. And inevitability, I think, is an important point. It irritates me when arguments are framed this way, that if we outlaw something which is life threatening or life destroying, well, it's going to be inevitable that people are going to make these alternative choices that are also life destroying. And that's not true. So in that sense, it's a very unfair argument. One final argument we often hear is that we who are pro-life are very concerned about life within the womb, and we lose our concern as soon as life comes to full term and is born. That we care about the unborn babies more than we care about babies once they're born. Once they've been born, we want to withhold assistance. We don't care what happens to the mother. We don't care what happens to the child. Just get the baby born and we're done with you. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think it was Congressman Barney Frank, who from Massachusetts, where I went to grad school, who, among others, made the zing to say, you people, you believe that life begins at conception and ends at birth.
Uh-huh.
But I think that it's a classic matter of the logical fallacy of deflection, and it's a bit equivalent to if two spouses are arguing, let's say my wife has a legitimate grievance with something I've done to upset her, and she's legitimately upset and trying to bring that to my attention. And rather than responding to her grievance or her pain, I were to just say, oh, yeah, what about this other thing? And I accuse her about something on a completely unrelated issue that has absolutely nothing to do with, it's completely irrelevant to what we're talking about. And my accusation may even be unfair, but besides, it's irrelevant. And that's a similar tactic to, oh yeah, what about these other issues about when the baby is after the baby is born? And I would say also, I mean, look at who has been leading the way in, not exclusively, but often in what I've seen in caring for foster children and adopting
Mm-hmm.
unwanted babies. It has been very heavily pushed within the pro-life community. And
Sure has.
I mean, adopting the baby yourself into your own home, that's how to care for that baby. That is about the biggest thing you can do. I think, I do think there should also be some room for Christian humility. None of us are perfect. And particularly if there are some brothers and sisters in Christ who share our faith, share our, core values, but they, if somebody comes to, me and says, John, I kind of feel that they have a concern that, they see me saying great things about the dignity of human life when I'm defending babies from abortion, but then I'm seeming like I don't care about some other particular assaults on human dignity of people who are already born, with regard to some other kinds of issues of human dignity. I think that we shouldn't have a categorical commitment to being reflexively defensive and saying no, 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 we're wrong. We should
Right.
be open to hearing those kind of things. Like, okay, well, on this other issue, what is something you want me to be more sensitive to, and be willing to hear that criticism in a humble and not always defensive way.
That's such a critical point there. I mean, I am all for us saying, you know what, we could do a better job of caring for children once they're born. We could do a better job of caring for all people. But is the answer then to kill life before it even has a chance to begin? I
Yes.
mean, I believe it has begun when it's in the womb, but my point is, for heaven's sake, the answer is to improve the way we are treating people once they are born, not to prevent them from being born. One last question. I'd love to hear your heart on this, John. I mean, we are talking primarily to a Christian population. Um, I hate to say it, but our attention span is short. I mean, I think we can be easily distracted. I think sometimes we prefer entertainment. I believe that, just for example, at that meeting you were discussing, if the Protestants were having a Christian rock band, you probably would have had a bigger crowd than you had for a pro-life
Mhm.
demonstration, if you will. And I think that's a shame. But how do you think the modern church can improve our ability to address this issue? What can we do better?
Well, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. Um, I think I think there has been some degree to which the modern Protestant church has been more awakened, but I think we could always be more awakened. I think pastors could be a bit less fearful. I understand that, and there's some contexts where you need to be sensitive and not word things in ways that alienate your audience. But I think one very clear area that's, I think, it's maybe not exactly related to going into Planned Parenthood for abortion, but it's very related, is that the fact that a lot of the evangelical community who even profess to pro-lifers, there's a lot of just simple ignorance about such things as how some commonly used, contraceptions, according to the science, depending on who you listen to, might function as actually not really as contraception, even though that's the word used, but to actually as abortifacient, or if couples are struggling with fertility, how some of these treatments of in vitro fertilization involve deliberately and knowingly creating quote unquote excess human embryos that are essentially killed. And I think that either one of these could be standard parts of when evangelical pastors, at the very least, do premarital counseling with couples, and they, let them know about, well, there's some contraceptive methods that you will want to. I mean, you can say Catholics don't have that problem because they don't believe in any kind of, artificial birth control. But for Protestants who don't have that same theological hang up, that, to the least, we don't want to do anything that would have even the potential to stop a human life after it's been conceived.
Hmm. Along that line, John, and that is so well put. I remember sitting in a human sexuality class in college back in the late 70s, and a guest speaker came in to lecture on abortion from a pro-life position. And this was a secular college. The class was not at all amenable to what she was saying. She was doing an excellent job articulating the pro-life position, though. And how she wrapped up the class, I mean, people could argue some of the finer points with her, but what she ended the class on was an inarguable point when she looked at everyone in the class and said, "Here is the bottom line. I would not look at any one of you and say, you did not deserve to be born. I am glad you're here. I am glad to know all of you. And I think all of you have valuable contributions to make to our world. Thank God you're here." Now, who's going to argue that and
Yeah.
say, "No, lady, we shouldn't have been born"? So on that point, I think that it was a reminder that there is a place for common sense arguments on this. And you know
Mhm.
what I really do feel too? There is something instinctive in us that I think knows darn well that the pro-life position is correct. Nobody teaches us to be deferential and gentle when we're in the presence of a pregnant woman, but we are. I
Yeah.
mean, we want to give her a seat. We want to kind of hover over her. As soon as we know somebody is pregnant, they're usually in. I think this is just across the board true. When a woman says, "I'm pregnant," nobody will say, "Oh, well, are you going to keep it or not?" I mean, generally, that is not a question that is asked unless maybe a
Mhm.
young girl is saying it to her mother. But in most cases, it's like, "Oh, celebratory. Well, congratulations. That's wonderful." Why? If it's just a choice, if it's just a blob, then there should not be the automatic default to a pro-life
Mhm.
position. But I think there is, and I think on this point, not only is the truth, God's truth, on our side, but God's truth evidenced even in human intuition, I think is very
Mhm.
much on our side.
I agree.
I sure appreciate both the work you've done on the issue. And by the way, John, work you've done in general. I would love to have you back on and talk more about progressive Christianity and also about sexuality. Would you come back on and discuss those with us at a later time?
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
know you've got a lot to say on all of them, and I know we could go on for hours even about
Yeah.
this. If people want to reach you and they want to find more about you and your organization, what is the best website to go to?
Thank you for asking. That would be www.tcc THEIRD.org. IRD is the acronym for Institute on Religion and Democracy. Unfortunately, the website IRD.org was already taken by a completely unrelated organization.
Oh,
So we're the Institute on Religion and Democracy. So you spell out THE and then IRD.org.
very good. That would be a good way then to be reaching you. Also, that would be a way people could have access to some of your writing, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. John, such a pleasure having you on the show again. Thank you for taking the time. You've given us some good talking points that we can use. God grant everybody have the courage to use them. Thanks so much
Thank
for
you.
being
God
with us.
bless you.
God bless.
Thanks for having me.
And hey, thank you for joining us today. This, I think, is one of the most critical conversations we could be having precisely because we've been having it for so long. I think to a lot of people, abortion is becoming a, oh, yeah, that again. Well, for heaven's sake, no. No, I mean, this is life and death. This is life and death. And I hope that all of us will recognize not only the importance of the issue, um, but also the concept of stewardship. We've been entrusted with truth. When you've been entrusted with truth, you will answer to the person who entrusted you with that truth for how well and how faithfully you have spoken it. Along that line, then, let's remember what Paul told Timothy about being a steward of truth. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle to all, apt to teach, patient, in meekness instructing those who oppose themselves, if perhaps God will grant them repentance according to the knowledge of the truth. 2 Timothy 2:24-25. Hey, let's always remember when it comes to speaking truth, it is not just where you stand, it is also how you stand. Thanks for being here. God bless.